Mark Carney just became the most dangerous man in Donald Trump's world, and he did it without firing a single shot. When Trump stood before the cameras and accused Canada of stealing American technology jobs, the entire political establishment waited for Canada to blink. They always blink. Except this time, Canada didn't just refuse to blink. Canada fired back. And what happened next is something Washington was not prepared for. If you are watching the news right now and you feel like something shifted, you are not imagining it. The relationship between the United States and Canada, the longest, most peaceful, most economically intertwined border in the history of the modern world, is being dismantled in real time. Not by war, not by a treaty collapse, but by one man in Washington who has decided that his neighbor to the north is no longer a partner. Canada is now a target. And the man Canada just sent to the front lines to answer that aggression is not backing down. You need to understand what is actually happening here, because what you are seeing on the surface is not the whole story. The headlines will tell you this is a trade dispute. The anchors will frame it as a diplomatic spat. They will use calm language and measured tones, and they will make it sound like two neighbors arguing over a fence. But that is not what this is. What this has always been since the moment Donald Trump returned to the White House, is a campaign of economic dominance disguised as patriotism. And Canada just called it by its real name. To understand why this moment is so explosive, you have to go back. Not years, decades. Because the assumption that just got shattered was not built overnight. It was built across generations of handshakes, trade agreements, shared defense pacts, and an unspoken rule that governed every interaction between Washington and Ottawa. That rule was simple. The United States and Canada do not threaten each other. They negotiate. They compromise. They find the middle ground. That was the rule. That was the operating assumption that every prime minister, every president, every trade secretary, and finance minister on both sides of that border has operated under since the end of the Second World War. The Canada-US relationship was not just a friendship. It was an architecture. It was the foundation upon which the entire North American economy was built. When the United States signed the original free trade agreement with Canada in 1988, and then expanded it into NAFTA in 1994, and then renegotiated it into the USMCA in 2020, what they were doing each time was reaffirming a core belief. The belief that these two countries are so economically intertwined that damaging one means damaging the other. $600 billion in annual trade, 2 million American jobs directly tied to Canadian commerce. Energy, lumber, auto parts, agriculture, the supply chains don't stop at the border. They flow through it like blood through a vein. That was the world everyone woke up in before this moment. That was the rule. And Donald Trump just broke it. Now you need to know who these men are, because this story does not make sense without understanding the characters driving it. Donald Trump is not a traditional president. You already know that. But what matters here is not his politics. It is his instinct. Trump operates on a principle he has held his entire adult life, long before he ever entered politics. Every relationship is a transaction. Every partnership has a winner and a loser. And if you are not the one extracting value, then you are the one being taken advantage of. This is not a governing philosophy he adopted for the White House. This is the worldview of a man who spent 40 years in New York real estate, where you either dominate the negotiation or you walk away with nothing. When Trump looks at Canada, he does not see an ally. He sees a counterparty that has been getting the better end of the deal. And in his mind, that ends now. Trump has been making noise about Canada since his first term. He called NAFTA the worst trade deal ever made. He slapped tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. He made jokes, or what sounded like jokes, about Canada becoming the 51st state. But nobody took that seriously. Nobody thought the rhetoric would become policy. Nobody believed that the most powerful country in the world would genuinely turn its economic weapons on a nation that shares 4,000 miles of border, a common language, a common defense structure through NATO, and more mutual economic dependency than almost any two nations on Earth. They underestimated him. Again, now meet Mark Carney. Because if Trump is the force of nature in this story, Carney is the immovable object. And the collision between those two things is what you are watching unfold right now. Mark Carney is not a politician by birth. He is an economist by training and a central banker by career. And that combination produces a very specific kind of man. A man who does not panic. A man who has sat in rooms during the 2008 global financial crisis and made decisions that affected the savings accounts and mortgage payments of millions of ordinary people, and done so with a steadiness that most politicians can only pretend to have. Carney served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. Then he did something almost unprecedented. He was recruited to become governor of the Bank of England, making him the first non-British citizen to lead that institution in its 300-year history. 300 years. And they picked a Canadian. When Carney entered federal politics and ultimately stepped into leadership of the Liberal Party following Justin Trudeau's departure, he brought with him something that Ottawa had been missing for years. Credibility that didn't need to be performed. Authority that came not from a campaign slogan, but from a track record that spanned two continents and two of the most consequential economic crises of the modern era. He is precise. He is controlled. He is deeply aware of how global capital moves, where power actually sits, and what the real cost of economic warfare looks like in the lives of working people. He is exactly the wrong person for Trump to have picked this fight with. Now here is what happened. Step by step, because the details matter. In the first quarter of 2025, as Trump's second administration settled into its posture of economic nationalism, the White House began making noise about the technology sector specifically. Trump and his advisors had become increasingly fixated on the fact that American tech companies, particularly in the artificial intelligence, semiconductor, and software development spaces, were expanding operations in Canada at a notable rate. Toronto had emerged as one of the fastest-growing tech hubs in the world. The University of Toronto's Artificial Intelligence Research Program, one of the most respected in the world, had been producing talent that companies like Google, Microsoft, and a wave of AI startups were hiring in significant numbers. And in many cases, those companies were choosing to house those operations in Canada rather than in American cities. The reasons for this were not mysterious. Canada's immigration system made it significantly easier to recruit global talent. Canadian corporate tax structures offered advantages in certain sectors. The cost of office space in Toronto, while rising, remained lower than San Francisco or New York. And Canada had made deliberate, strategic policy decisions to position itself as a destination for exactly this kind of high-skill, high-value economic activity. From a Canadian perspective, this was smart governance. From Trump's perspective, this was theft. In March 2025, Trump made the accusation explicit. Standing before reporters, he declared that Canada had been systematically luring technology jobs and talent away from American workers. He used the word stealing, not competing, not attracting, stealing. And he announced that his administration was considering a new wave of tariffs specifically targeting the technology and services sector, on top of the sweeping tariffs that had already been imposed on Canadian goods earlier in his term. He framed it in language designed to reach the working-class voter in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. The voter who has watched manufacturing jobs disappear over decades and is ready to believe that someone, somewhere, is to blame. The political calculation was obvious. Trump was turning Canada into a villain that his base could understand. Not China, which is distant and abstract. Canada, your neighbor. The polite country that waves at you from across the fence. Trump was saying that even they are stealing from you. Even they cannot be trusted. What he did not anticipate was what came next. Mark Carney did not hold a press conference and express concern. He did not issue a diplomatic statement calling for dialogue. He did not send a cabinet minister to Washington to quietly negotiate behind closed doors, the way Canada had always handled American pressure in the past. He did none of the things that Ottawa has historically done when Washington turned up the heat. Instead, Carney stood up in front of the Canadian public and said, in language so clear and so unambiguous that it could not be misread or softened by any spin doctor on either side of the border, that Canada would not be lectured about economic fairness by an administration that was using tariffs as a political weapon rather than a trade instrument. He said that Canada had not stolen anything. Canada had built something. And there is a difference between a country that attracts talent through investment and policy excellence, and a country that loses talent because it has failed to create the conditions for that talent to stay. He said it calmly. He said it precisely. And he said it with the air of a man who has testified before parliamentary committees, navigated G7 summits, and managed the Bank of England through the uncertainty of Brexit, a man who is not impressed by volume and is not moved by accusation. Trump's team was not pleased. Reports emerged almost immediately that the response from the White House was one of genuine anger. Trump, according to sources familiar with the situation, viewed Carney's public pushback not as a policy disagreement, but as a personal affront. In Trump's transactional world, when you apply pressure, the other side is supposed to come to the table. They are supposed to negotiate from a position of deference. Carney had not done that. Carney had pushed back in public, in front of the world, and he had done it with an authority and a calmness that made Trump look like the aggressor, because he was the aggressor. And here is where you have to follow the money, because this is not just about pride. This is about something far more consequential. The technology sector is the most valuable economic sector in the world right now. Artificial intelligence alone is projected to add between $10 and $15 trillion to global GDP over the next decade, depending on whose numbers you use. The competition to lead that transformation, to house the research, to attract the engineers, to build the infrastructure, is the economic competition of the 21st century. It makes the space race look like a science fair. Canada understood this early. The Canadian government, through programs like the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in AI research clusters in Toronto, Montreal, and Edmonton. Geoffrey Hinton, the man widely considered the godfather of modern deep learning, the foundational technology behind the AI explosion, built his career at the University of Toronto. The talent pipeline flowing out of Canadian universities into the global tech economy is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate, sustained investment over more than a decade. When Trump says Canada is stealing tech jobs, what he is actually revealing is that the United States failed to make those same investments with the same consistency. America has world-class universities. America has Silicon Valley. But America also has an immigration system that has made it increasingly difficult for the global talent those universities train to stay and work legally. America has a political environment that has, at various moments, made international researchers and engineers feel unwelcome. And America has a federal government that has lurched between investment and austerity in research funding in ways that create uncertainty for the long-term bets that building a tech ecosystem requires. Canada didn't steal anything. Canada showed up while America was busy fighting with itself. But here is the deeper truth, the one the mainstream coverage is missing, the one that makes this moment not just about technology or tariffs, or even Trump and Carney as individuals. What you are watching right now is the United States attempting to use economic coercion against a democratic ally to compensate for its own domestic policy failures. Think about what that means. The most powerful country in the history of the world, a country with the largest military, the deepest capital markets, the most influential cultural exports, is pointing its finger at Canada and calling foul because Canada created conditions that made talented people want to live and work there. That is not the behavior of a confident superpower. That is the behavior of an empire that knows, at some level, that it is losing the competition it once dominated effortlessly. And rather than doing the hard work of examining why, rather than looking honestly at its immigration dysfunction, its crumbling research infrastructure, its political instability, it is choosing to blame its neighbor. This is what empires do when they start to slip. They stop competing and start accusing. They stop building and start punishing. They mistake aggression for strength and confuse their allies' success with their own failure. Mark Carney recognized this, and he refused to play along. That refusal is what made Trump angry, not the policy disagreement, not the tariff debate, the refusal to accept the frame, the refusal to stand before the American president and say, yes, you are right. We are sorry. Tell us what you need. Carney looked at that frame and threw it back across the border. And in doing so, he signaled something to the rest of the world. Every country watching this dynamic unfold, that the old deference is over. Now let's talk about what comes next. Because if you think this ends with a press conference, you are not paying attention. In the next 30 days, the pressure points are going to multiply. Trump's team will almost certainly escalate. The tools available to them include additional tariffs on Canadian technology exports and services, restrictions on cross-border data flows, executive actions targeting Canadian companies operating in the American market, and political pressure on American tech companies that have significant Canadian operations to bring jobs back across the border. These are not hypothetical. These are the instruments of economic warfare that this administration has already shown it is willing to use. Canada's response will determine the trajectory of North American politics for years. If Carney holds the line, if he refuses to capitulate quietly, if he continues to speak with the clarity and authority he has demonstrated so far, then he forces Trump into a position of either escalating to a level that damages the American economy as much as the Canadian one, or backing down. And backing down is not something this White House does comfortably or gracefully. The best case scenario is that the pressure produces a negotiation, a real one where both sides sit down and have an honest conversation about talent pipelines, research investment, immigration policy, and what a genuinely fair technology economy looks like in North America. There is a version of this story where the confrontation becomes the catalyst for a serious bilateral policy rethink that ultimately benefits workers on both sides of the border. The worst-case scenario is something darker. If Trump escalates and Canada retaliates, and Canada has significant retaliatory tools, including control over energy exports that American states depend on, you are looking at a trade war between the two most economically integrated countries on Earth. The cost of that war would not be paid by Donald Trump. It would not be paid by Mark Carney. It would be paid by the auto worker in Windsor and the farmer in Iowa and the software engineer in Waterloo and the small business owner in Detroit. It would be paid by ordinary people on both sides of a border that has never before been treated as a battlefield. That is the road this is heading down. And the question of whether it reaches that destination depends almost entirely on whether the man in Washington decides that punishing an ally is worth the price his own people will pay for it. Here is what you need to take away from everything you just heard. This is not a story about Canada and the United States having a disagreement. This is a story about power, who has it, who is trying to hold on to it, and what happens when the tools of dominance get turned on the people who were supposed to be protected by them. Canada is not America's enemy. Canada has never been America's enemy, but it is being treated like one. And the reason it is being treated like one is not because Canada did something wrong. It is because Canada did something right, and that success became inconvenient for a narrative that needs a villain. Mark Carney understands this. He understands it better than most because he has spent his entire career watching how power and capital and political will interact in moments of crisis. He knows that the way you respond to a bully is not with apology. It is with clarity. It is with evidence. It is with the willingness to stand in front of the world and say, we built this, and we are not giving it back. The world is watching what Canada does next. But more importantly, the world is watching what America does next. Because the way a great power treats its closest friend tells you everything about what kind of great power it has chosen to become. So here is the question I want you to sit with. And I want you to answer this in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think. If the United States continues down this road, using tariffs and accusations and economic pressure not against adversaries, but against democratic allies who simply outcompeted them, what does that tell you about the future of American leadership in the world? And is there any version of this story where both countries come out stronger on the other side? Leave your answer below. Because the next chapter of this story is being written right now, and your understanding of it matters more than you think.